In this video, we'll take a look at RNotebooks in RStudio. An RNotebook is nothing more than a sequence of text and R code that can be executed and rendered to a file that can be shared with others. The text is written in R Markdown, a formatting syntax for plain text that, when passed through a software tool, can generate documents in other formats like HTML and Word document or PDF. For this demo, we'll use an RStudio project I already have. That's called demo. So let's create our first RNotebook file. We can create the file in two ways. One is by using the file menu, from which we choose new file and the RNotebook. And the other way is to use the new file button in the main application button bar. It is the first button at the left. From the drop-down menu, choose the RNotebook. So let's use the second option and create a new RNotebook file. Once the command completes, the content of the file is shown in the editor. The file already has some demo content. It is automatically named Untitled 1, but not yet saved to disk. So first thing, let's save it. We'll call it Notebook Demo. When saved, the RStudio will append the RMD extension, which it uses to recognize the type of file and determine how to handle it. When saved, RStudio automatically generates another file called notebookdemo.nb.html, which is the rendered version of our RNotebook source file. The format is HTML, the format for the web, and can be previewed in any web browser. So let's look at how an RNotebook is structured. The first section at the top of the file is the document header, separated from the rest of the document. It includes instructions and settings for how R should handle the file, what type of output formats should be available, and a few other settings such as document title. Some of the settings in the heading, such as the title, will be displayed in the document. There are a few others, but for now, let's not complicate things too much. After the heading, we can see content in R Markdown format and a chunk of R code. The text offers some initial guidance to how to work with RNotebooks, and it's worth reading at least once. The next step to take before we move into writing our own notebook is to do an initial preview. So click on the Preview button and watch the content being displayed in the Viewer tab in the lower right, if it's not already there from when you saved the file for the first time. We can see that it looks almost the same, but with fancier formatting. The special syntax has been converted to the appropriate formatting, like italics or links, and after the first render, the preview will automatically update every time the source file is changed and saved. One problem though, the rendered output shows the R code chunk exactly as it is in the source file. This is proper behavior because nothing is including in the output that has not been run before. Therefore, we need to return to the source file and run the R code chunk. RStudio offers multiple options for running R code. We can run the entire R code chunk using the little green arrow at the top right of the gray code chunk. We can use the Run button at the top of the editor window, or by placing the cursor inside the chunk and pressing Ctrl-Shift-Enter or Command-Shift-Return on the Mac. Or we can run each line of code by placing the cursor on the line and pressing Ctrl-Enter on the PC or Command-Return on the Mac. When the R code chunk is executed, the output of the R code is placed right below the code chunk and will be including in the output the next time the file is rendered. So let's just save the file and see how the output looks like. As you can see, the plot is now including in the output. If you work on your own alongside this video, you can now open the output file, the notebookdemo.nb.html in the web browser, and see that it looks the same. To do that, just click on the name of the file in the File Manager and choose the option to View in Web Browser. Okay, now that we understand a little bit of how RNotebooks work, let's try to edit the file to make it do some work for us. If you follow up with me, you should download the practice.csv file and save it in the project folder. First, let's clean up the file. We'll remove the entire content, which was demo, and leave the document header in place. Then let's give it a new name. which will be printed out in the output. So let's call it RNotebook demo. Then save the file and click on Preview to refresh the viewer. The document should be just a blank page with a title. For your work in this class, you will be asked to document everything you do. That means that you would use the text in the RNotebook file to explain what you're going to do before you write the code and discuss any output as needed. The first action, as you will see in most of these situations, is to read the data that comes from somewhere. In this case, it's a file on disk, a CSV file. So let's write an explanation of what we're going to do. For me, it's going to be simple. You will need to be a little bit more detailed in how you explain things. First, enter a couple of blank lines, which are Markdown needs to separate between paragraphs so that it can understand where a paragraph ends and the next one starts. Then enter the first line of text, which reads import data from file and create a data frame. I'm using a text expansion utility to speed up the demos, so you'll have to type it in at your end if you follow up with the video. Then let's write the R code chunk to make that happen. We can create an R code chunk in a few ways. One is to use the Insert button in the Editor button bar and choose R from the dropdown. The second one would be to use the key combination Ctrl plus Alt plus I, all three keys hold down to the same time. And the third is just to write it in the document as text. In the end, the RNotebook is just a text file. So let's go on with inserting it using the menu button. The command inserts an empty chunk of code at the cursor and places the cursor inside. Before we move forward, let's look at the anatomy of a chunk of code. It's simple. It starts and ends with 3 backticks. The key is the first one at the top left of the keyboard on the numbers row. The first set is followed by a set of curly braces with the letter R inside, which tells RStudio that this is R code. It can have other values for other languages, but it's not the purpose of this demo or the class. If properly entered, the area is highlighted in gray and it shows 3 icons at the top right. The first one gives access to the set of chunk options. The second one runs all the code chunks before. And the third one runs the current code chunk. When working with longer documents, we may need to rerun the code before, and the second button makes it easy. The same functionality is also accessible from the Run button in the Editor menu bar. So let's enter the code to read the data and store it in the practice variable. Then run the code. If it worked, we will see the practice variable showing up in the Environment tab. Let's now see how the data looks like. For that, we'll use the head function, which returns in table format the first few rows of data. Now that we know how the data looks like and how the variables are set, which are factors, which are numeric and all that, let's do something with it. Let's calculate the sum of the score variable in the data frame. Explain first, then enter the R code, and then run it. The sum will be printed below the code chunk. Nevertheless, just displaying the data is not necessarily that helpful. It cannot be reused, so it would be much more helpful to store it in a variable so that we can use it later in other operations. So let's enter a new line of code and store the sum in the score sum variable. Don't forget to run the code. The problem now is that the sum is not printed out in the output anymore. So we'll have to tell R to do that. For that, we'll use a different command. So in the same chunk, we enter a new line of code. Then rerun the code chunk. In the end, let's use the variable we just created to do something else. Let's calculate its square. Again, explain what you're doing, enter the code, and see what happens. We can calculate the square of a variable in one of 2 ways. We can do that by simply multiplying the variable by itself, as is the case for the first line of code, or we can use R's notation for raising the variable to a power and raise the variable to the second power, which will give us the square.